welcome to introduce our today's speaker, Dr. Wayel Azmeh. First of all, Dr. Azmeh, assalamu alaikum and welcome. Ahlan wa sahlan.
Thank you. Ahlan wa sahlan.
His focus is on Islamic reformation and the relationship between Shari'a and state. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Azmeh to talk today about the following topic, which is reading the religio-philosophical concept of Tawhid or monotheism and its implications. Dr. Azmeh, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. And just a few introductory notes. This is the fruit of my reading of Islam over the last 35 years in the context of American modernity and interfaith dialogue. Every individual is entitled to address Islam, Christianity, or any other religion from whatever angle he finds appropriate. Religions belong to God, and according to Quranic statement, means human beings. Nobody has the monopoly on anything, and no entity or individual has the right to monopolize interpreting religion. When I refer to Abrahamic religions here, this has no relationship whatsoever with recent political slogans of the religions of Abraham, which we are seeing being promoted in the Middle East, which is purely political. And what I'm going to talk today is going to be within those 5 points. First, I'm going to talk about Al-Ahad. And I struggled to find an English translation for Al-Ahad. And the closest I could come to was the only. You can say the unique, you can say, but I think Al-Ahad is unique, is Al-Ahad. Monotheism in Christianity, because it is pertinent in what we're trying to do here today. And then the implications of monotheism. We'll visit Al-Fitra, and then alternative paradigms to facilitate a broader reach out. So basically, I want to talk about Tawheed in its broad meaning or encompassing meaning, which should lead monotheists and muwahhideen to connecting with all humanity and to cooperating with all humanity, monotheists and others, on good deeds, which today in the world arena people call human rights. So monotheism connotes the belief in God as the only, Ahad, whom there is nothing similar unto him, a unique entity with no parallel, who is at the same distance of all his creatures. There are no chosen people, there are no people closer or not. God is at the same distance for all humanity, and God is God of everybody, and God treats all human beings with justice based on what they do. There are no favorites. Al-Ahad is always one, but everyone, but if you say one God, this means there might be 2 gods, 3 gods, 4 gods, 5 gods. So that's why the word one is not like the word Ahad. So if you say one, it could be there are 2 or 3 or 4. If you say 1, 2, 3, 4, it could be that there is one. But if you say Ahad, that's it. There's just, certainly it is one, but it is one that is unique, and there are no 2 or 3 or 4 of Al-Ahad. And that's the deep meaning of monotheism. Akhenaten, who's the Egyptian pharaoh, who died in 1336 BC, called for the worship of Atun as the one God, and called to chasing out all the other gods. So Atun is one God, but he is not Ahad, because there are other gods, and he chose this God. So it is not really monotheism. They call it, there is an English expression, they call it monolatry. Monolatry, one God, you choose one God. That's not what monotheism is about. Monotheism is about Al-Ahad. Al-Fakhr Razi, who is a famous interpreter of the Quran around the 11th century, he says, if you say one man cannot fight this wrestler, it would be possible to say, but two men can fight this wrestler, or three men can fight this wrestler. And that's what he says here. We're talking about one or two or three. But if you say no one can fight this wrestler, then it doesn't make sense to say, but two can. And in Arabic, if you say, لا يقاومه أحد, once you use the word أحد, that's it. It's just exclusive to this one. And it's very important to bear in mind this very deep meaning of monotheism and distinguish it. And that's why I think using the word ahad might be more conducive to avoiding misunderstanding. Now, since we are talking about monotheism, we need to talk about Christianity. And here I want to tell you a little bit, because there is a big block, a big wall between Muslims and Christians, because many Muslims think that Christianity and polytheism are one thing. And I'm going to show you why I think this is not true. And I'm interested in this for one reason, because I'm interested in opening the door to cooperating with other people who are monotheists. I'm not interested into going in depth into Christology or Christian theology, except to achieve that purpose. Despite the Quran opposition to the concept of the Holy Trinity, of course, to Islam that's not acceptable, there's no Trinity. In spite of that, and referring to some Christians as denier of truth, لَقَدْ كَفَرَ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ ثَالِثُ ثَلَاثَةٍ. Yet, Quran never used the term kuffar to refer to Christians or Christianity as a whole. There's always talking about Christians, about Ahlul Kitab, and not talking about them as kuffar. Talked about some of them who denied the truth were kuffar, but did not label Christianity as a whole or Christians as such. What the Quran designated as blasphemy is considering Jesus as God, or Jesus as one of three gods, because that's polytheism, of course. This understanding is not the dominant one amongst Christians, and that's the nuance that we need to understand, because Quran exhorts us to telling the truth and learning the truth exactly as it is, without exaggeration. Mina is a priest, is a contemporary priest at the Coptic Egyptian Orthodox Church. He quotes Saint Augustine, who died 430, who was a very important philosopher and Christian theologian of North Africa, Tunisia, who said that the Trinity's hypostases are not separate, but rather work without an S, as one individual unit. The doctrinal canon attributed to Athanasius, circa 5th century, states one God in a Trinity and a Trinity in unity. There are no three gods, but only one God. So you can see here, there's monotheism, although there's objection from a Muslim point of view to the Trinity. But you're seeing here we're in gray area. An Egyptian evangelical priest, Imaj Hada, comments that the concept of the Trinity is beyond human understanding. He concludes that faith, or the lack thereof, in the Trinity has no impact in the Christian faith. The former Catholic Pope Ratzinger, known as Benedict XIV, declares in his book, Any attempt towards encompassing God within our human mind is doomed to be impossible. For we cannot talk about him appropriately, may he be exalted, unless we give up trying to understand him, his nature, unless we respect his unfathomable nature. Finally, the late Roman Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch and the rest of the East in Syria, Ignatius Hazim, said that Christians and Muslims in Syria have interacted on informal levels and enjoyed an almost identical consciousness of God's exaltation. They are endowed with the same confidence in God's providence and faith in their humbleness and Islam. Islam here means surrender to God. So I have, as you have seen, different Christian authorities, even though they say Trinity, but the way they explain, they say one God. So here it's important to realize that they are monotheist, but from Islamic point of view, of course, there are objections, but they are monotheists, and there are things that might be in a gray area. And if you go to the internet and look at the Catholic Encyclopedia, it says, we believe that God is one. So I think it's important to know how many Christians believe about God, and that they believe that God is one, in spite of the differences about certain details about what the Trinity is. And in fact, throughout the years in interfaith dialogue, I have noticed, the first thing I learned and noticed, that no two Christians believe the same way or understand the same way the Trinity. It's not just one thing. And you saw what some contemporary authorities says. And that's and that's how one should look at the Quran, exhorting people, say, "O followers of earlier revelation, come unto the tenet which we and you hold in common, that we shall worship none but God, and that we shall not ascribe divinity to aught beside him." So Christians are monotheists, even though there are some sects in Christianity that the Quran denounced that are not, and in spite of the differences about what this Trinity means. And this is important because it's important to understand what your neighbor thinks and not to mischaracterize him. Just understand exactly what your neighbor thinks, or what I should say the majority of our neighbors, Christian neighbors, think. So what does monotheism imply? The Quran emphasizes the sole origin of all humanity without specifying who was created first, Adam or Eve, which can be interpreted as primordial equality between all sexes, all nations, all tribes, or everybody is equal in the sight of God, and they are all the children of Adam. God also states the equality of all humanity, with the only distinction coming from piety that guides good deeds. So God didn't say the followers of Muhammad are superior, or the followers of Jesus are superior, or the followers of Moses are the chosen people, anything like that. Piety. And the verse that we always encounter, "O people, we have created you out of male and female and made you into nations and tribes so that you know one another. Verily, the most honored amongst you, the most honorable amongst you are the most pious." That's it, regardless of what religious faith you use, as long as you are monotheist. Furthermore, the Quran exhorts people to uphold justice and charity towards one another, and cautions them against committing acts of extreme moral ugliness and acts reprehensible to a sane mind. And we'll get to the detail of that And here's the verse that God admonishes you to uphold justice and charity and giving the poor their due and giving those of kin their due, and admonishes you to stay away from what a sane mind finds as reprehensible. It's even open. What the sane mind finds as reprehensible, and from oppression. So God talks to humanity, because He is God of all of humanity, and telling them to avoid things that the sane human mind, or what we call even fitra in Islam, finds reprehensible. And this concept, this way of looking at things that God talks to us, is what really originated the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. So God declares in the Qur'an that He forgives all sins and that His mercy encompasses His wrath. But the Qur'an branded polytheism as extreme oppression. And so extreme oppression, but oppression, who is being oppressed here? What is polytheism oppressing? It couldn't be God. And nobody can oppress God, of course. Then who is being oppressed? It must be oppression through which a polytheist humiliates himself or herself and results in deviation away from justice towards other human beings. Because the only people who can be affected is not God, it's the human beings. God declares in the Quran on 2 occasions that He will not forgive polytheism. So God does not forgive polytheism, associating others with Him, but forgives what is lesser than that. And then the verse that follows here, this is from Surah An-Nisa. Are you not aware of those who consider themselves pure? Or in other words, of those who exalt themselves. So you can see a hint here towards this polytheism that really is connected to people thinking that they're better than other people, which would lead to oppressing other people, to having the rights of other people. The second verse also, it starts by saying, but for him who after guidance has been vouchsafed to him, cuts himself off from the apostle and follows a path other than that of the believers. So this polytheism that God doesn't forgive is resulting in those who just cut themselves off and follow a different path. And the path of the Prophet and the believers who are with the Prophet is a path of justice. And if you cut yourself off, then what are you going to do? Not justice, certainly, but you're going to do injustice. You're going to be oppressing other people. Okay. ومن يشاقق الرسول من بعد ما تبين له الهدى ويتبع غير سبيل المؤمنين نوله ما تولى ونصله جهنم وساءت مصيرا إن الله لا يغفر أن يشرك به ويغفر ما دون ذلك لمن يشاء ومن يشرك بالله فقد ضل ضلالا بعيدا. That's my wife, by the way, and whenever I skip something, or she reminds me, not only at home, but also outside the home. Lucky for the audience. Now, I'm going to give you an example from the caste system in India, which is still practiced in some remote areas, even though it is outlawed, it is illegal in India. And this caste system, I would like to take it as an example of oppression that comes from polytheism, because there are separate norms for separate castes connected with different deities. And this table shows that basically in one of the cultures of Hinduism, and I have to say, Hinduism is not one thing. And there are within Hinduism itself people who are against the caste system, and it is the name of that way is Bhakti, and one of the major advocates was Mahatma Gandhi. So one again should be objective and should not generalize at all Hinduism. And anyway, Hinduism is so many different religions as well that go from one spectrum to the other, and some of them are, as in Upanishads, quite monotheistic. So, the priests were created from the mouth of the eternal spirit, and they are supposed to worship Brahma, which is the one and only God. The warriors created from the arms, and they should worship different gods. They should worship Durga and Indra, martial deities. The merchants from the thighs, and they worship Lakshmi and Kubera, and then the laborers from the feet, and they serve the higher castes, and their access to they are polluted and bought from certain temples and certain rituals. And so you can see how, we are not talking about monotheism here, polytheism. And then there's a fifth, which are unclassifiable. They are even in a worse situation. They call it the Dalit, the untouchables, and they're out of the caste system altogether. Now, the difficulty is, if you are an untouchable, your children will be untouchable, your grandchildren will be untouchable, and it's very rare for somebody to be able to break through and move to a luckier caste, which means that oppression is institutionalized in the minds of people, if not in the laws and social norms, which means oppression is institutionalized and backed up by the power of religion in that particular sect. Again, that's not all of Hinduism. Now, we come back. Why does God not forgive people who associate others with him? In Islamic law, God will not forgive someone who committed injustice against another person unless the wronged person grants forgiveness. So if you have a system of polytheism where somebody is oppressed, then the oppressor is going to be accountable, and God will not forgive unless the victim forgives. That's how I see the interpretation, because God says he forgives all sins. It makes sense to conclude that when polytheism results in injustice and oppression against another person, God would not forgive it unless the victim of the oppression grants forgiveness. Now, another implication, the Quran designates Abraham as the foremost of Muslims, not the first Muslim, but foremost in the leadership of Muslims, meaning that those who surrender to God. Islam here is a general term that captures any practice of surrendering to God alone with all ethical implications. This kind of surrender to God is not the sole purview of one religion, because God is accessible to any human being. Accordingly, the Quran declares that the only religion with God is surrender to the only. And Allah is linked, Allah is the Arabic term, is linked to the Ahad. When you say Allah, everybody understands it is Qul huwa Allahu Ahad. So again, this monotheism is conducive to justice. It is not possible to separate or to sever monotheism from justice. And that's why whoever seeks a religion other than surrender to God, Islam here means surrender to God, is not going to be acceptable. Unfortunately, some people think other than us here, God will not accept, which is against really what the Quran is saying. And therefore, the call that I just mentioned, the verse earlier, to people of the book to come together at one word that we all share, and that's to worship God and God alone. Not only that, the Quran even say, and let those who received the gospel make moral judgment based on the gospel. God is saying that. And those who do not make judgment based on what God has given them, those are corrupt. Again, the way you understand that is all is stemming from monotheism, and the Quran has a vision, a view of human society as diverse, and the only thing that cannot be tolerated is the oppression of polytheism, where people are disenfranchised. And then we got to the fitrah, which is I translated as the innate values. The Muslim faith connects with the innate set of ethical values that all human beings are born with. One can call them common sense, such as abhorrence for killing, stealing, cheating, etc. The Quran does not invent moral values, but awakens them in people and guides them to impact human relations. Because God has created those values in people to begin with, and then religion comes to guide them and augment them. And فطرة الله التي فطر الناس عليها لا تبديل لخلق الله. And again here, and let there be amongst you a group of people who would call people to doing good and who would admonish them to do what the human mind knows is good. See how open the term is. And who advise them against doing things that the sane human mind find as reprehensible. So this goes beyond just what fiqh says. It goes, any action that a human being does should be guided by fitrah, should be guided by making the right moral judgment, which, of course, the revelation and the Quran would enforce. So based on fitrah, innate values, awareness, one can explain someone lacking in the virtue of truthfulness, for example, in spite of praying 5 prayers. People somehow, we're human beings, we have difficulties, and sometimes our fitrah awareness can be eclipsed a little bit for whatever reasons, growing up under certain circumstances or so on. And we might doing 5 prayers, but still lacking that part because we didn't connect our prayers and try to really brighten our heart and bring our fitrah out. It happens. That's human failing, right? Or even somebody has lost their way to God, but they still maintain a high ethical standard, right? I mean, we see people who are not religious, but when it comes to certain moral issues, they are very moral. Somehow they lost their connection to God, but there is still this fitrah, and they might not be aware of it. That makes them still ethical human beings. Based on this understanding of fitrah, one can better understand some of the Prophet's utterances. I have certainly been commissioned to complete the ethical values. So ethical values exist, and the Prophet, God has sent the Prophet in order to perfect them, in order to help emphasize them. The best amongst you in Jahiliyyah are the best in Islam. Somebody who is moral before Islam, those people, when they connect with the Prophet, they are likely to be the best also in Islam. And then we all remember Hilf al-Fudul, that before the Prophet was a prophet, he was a kid, and the tribe leaders met and said, well, we will commit, and if anybody is wrong, we will all come together and make sure that justice is made. And the Prophet said, and those were polytheists. And therefore, the Prophet said, if those people come, if this happens now during Islam, I'll be willing to participate in it. Because he's willing to participate with people who were polytheists, but who were wanting to apply justice. And the Prophet said he would be willing to participate in it. And finally, there are other paradigms to facilitate a broader reach out. Can unaided reason envision major ethical values without the help of religious faith? And Immanuel Kant thinks that yes, through his rational system. So some people can get to ethics even without religion. Of course, I'm not advocating that, but I'm just trying to describe the world we live in, the world we need to interact with, and we need to interact with everybody. Therefore, whether people arrive at consciousness of high moral values through monotheistic Abrahamic faith, with the help of fitra, innate values, common sense, or philosophy like Immanuel Kant, the practical result is one. There is important overlap between those values and what we call today human rights. So to conclude, monotheism provides a solid base of which high moral values can be enhanced and implemented in a fashion worthy of God's Khalifa, vicegerent, which is Adam. Diversity of Abrahamic religions can be envisioned as rosary beads, sharing one divine monotheistic thread conducive to affirming human rights in spite of theological differences that I mentioned. Monotheists can cooperate with others on human rights even if they come from a totally different perspective, because everyone is responsible for their conscience, their relationship with God, but for working here on earth, doing what is good, try to implement justice with the maximum number of people is our duty all. And then, lakum dinukum waliya din. God will judge everyone. That's not for us to judge. Monotheists can even cooperate with polytheists on human rights as long as they affirm justice and equality of the human race. It would be impossible to work with bigoted people who affirm racist values and deny equality of the human race, even if they claim monotheism, because they are contradicting themselves and quoted scripture for their actions that then violate their words. Those are the only people that we cannot cooperate with, because then that will be cooperating on evil, racism. And finally, the story, I just came from Egypt and I met a lady. She's in her 50s. Her name is Amal. Translation is hope. And this lady, she is memorizing Quran at that age, and she's still young, of course, but you know, usually people memorize Quran when they are much younger. So she's memorizing Quran. She goes 3 times a day to different teachers to memorize Quran and Tajweed and so on. And she has a daughter who lives in a modern place in Cairo. But she refused to go and join her daughter and her grandchildren. And she said, that's because I am used to hearing adhan in my neighborhood. And she added, and I'm also used to hearing the church bell in my neighborhood. And I don't want to leave that and go and live there, out there, where there is neither. So this lady, in her fitra understanding, in her just wonderful understanding, her true religiosity, which encompasses all her neighbors and which does not contradict her faith in Islam and Quran, and doesn't yet, she's able to be kind and loving to all her neighbors regarding of diversity. Thank you very much.